Court of Appeals decision. Now, just in the last 10 minutes, we heard Judge Cahill literally say that that motion for continuance is still up for consideration. Do you foresee a situation where that's granted, where this is delayed? Yeah, we heard yesterday, I know exactly what exchange you're referencing. The prosecutor says, I don't know which way this cuts, for us or against us, and the judge says that it doesn't matter. The fact is that it does cut.
Yes.
So yes, that was interesting. Okay, you mentioned that you foresee this motion on continuance, this motion to delay the trial, really relying on what those 7 jurors say when they come back tomorrow. How common, I know everything is unprecedented with this trial, but how common is it to call back half of your jury that's been selected to ask them if they've heard more information about a case? Not only bring them back, they're bringing them back over Zoom. And you talked
Right.
about there wasn't a grand jury in this case because it would have been done over Zoom. They didn't really want this case to be the guinea pig. Have there been other cases in the age of COVID where things with jurors are done over Zoom at all, or is this pretty... All right, that right there wraps up jury selection for today. We are ending the day where we actually started with 9 jurors. Some interesting things happened on the jury today. This afternoon, we did get 2 new members of the jury, juror number 79 and juror number 85. That brings our total number to 9. Now, if you're saying, how did we get 2 new jurors and we end with 9 and started with 9, that's because 2 jurors who were previously seated last week were actually dismissed this morning. And the reason for that being those 7 jurors who were selected last week were called back into the courtroom today via Zoom to answer some questions about the settlement between the city of Minneapolis and George Floyd's family. Basically, on Friday afternoon, that news broke. And on Monday morning, the defense attorney, Eric Nelson, says, hey, I think we need to call back those 7 we had previously seated and ask them if they heard about this news and ask them if this impacts their ability to be on the jury. So that's what they did this morning and ended up dismissing 2 jurors. So a really quick recap of what happened today first. 2 new jurors were added this afternoon after those 2 existing jurors were removed this morning. So that brings our total juror count up to 9. Also, a few orders of business taken care of before they ended for the day. Judge Cahill says on Friday he will have an answer on Eric Nelson's motion to delay this trial and to change the venue. All of that information came up on Monday when Eric Nelson said because of the announcement of that settlement, he wanted the trial date pushed back and he wanted the venue changed. Judge Cahill has left the door open on that all week, but just now we heard him say on Friday he's going to have an answer for that. We also just heard before we ended for the day, Judge Cahill say that the defense is going to get 3 additional strikes and the prosecution is going to get 1 additional strike because of that information on the settlement that came out last week. So Judge Cahill kind of expressing his sympathy there of understanding that that new information really could have an impact on potential jurors that they're bringing into the courtroom. And I think this morning when they called back those 7 jurors from last week, we really got a sense of how great that impact could be. So what I want to play for you next is sound of those 2 jurors who were dismissed this morning. That's juror number 36. He's a Hispanic male in his 20s. On his questionnaire, he had said already that he had a very negative opinion of Derek Chauvin, but during voir dire, when he was being questioned, he said he could put that aside. So you'll hear from juror 36, and he'll talk about how the announcement of that settlement changed his mind. Then you're also going to hear from juror number 20. He's a white male in his 30s, actually getting married on May 1st. So that was something during his questioning that came up and was a concern. But you'll hear from him as well about how the settlement impacted his ability to be an impartial juror. So right now you'll hear from 2 of the 2 jurors who were dismissed this morning. These are 2 jurors who were selected last week but got the boot this morning. So take a listen to that. Is with these last 2 jurors, if neither of them are selected, we'll be waiting to see if Judge Cahill calls jurors back tomorrow or if he leaves it at 14. 15 was just his desire. He said he would like to get to that point. I do want to point out a case where someone has been dismissed. I'm talking about juror number 120. That was the first juror that we heard from today when they came back from the lunch break. And the example of why this juror was dismissed by Judge Cahill is really a theme that we've seen
running throughout this entire jury selection, and that's people having knowledge of news that's broke over the last couple of weeks. Specifically, one of his concerns is news related to this $27 million settlement between the city of Minneapolis and George Floyd's family. Judge Cahill, when these potential jurors are getting up to the stand, is asking them if they know anything about the case that isn't in their questionnaire. So months ago, these jurors filled out an extensive 14-page questionnaire about what they know about this case. And then when they get up on the stand, one of the first things Judge Cahill asks them is, has anything changed? Have you learned anything new? Have you learned about any civil litigation in this case? And that's an opportunity for a juror to say what they might have heard. Hearing news related to this case is not going to get them dismissed as a juror. However, if that news impacts their ability to be impartial, they can be dismissed. So I want to show you juror number 120 today, going through voir dire, going through this questioning process, and it's an example of how knowledge of this case can get you dismissed from the jury. So this is juror number 120 who has been dismissed. Seated that one, juror number 18 today. So you heard Judge Cahill say they're going to be back in at 9 o'clock tomorrow, and we'll call in a group of jurors, and he seems confident that they will likely be able to find their 15th and final juror tomorrow. So what I want to do for you right now is just play a bit of juror number 118's questioning, since this is our newest member on the jury. And again, what you'll hear is a lot of questions of Eric Nelson asking her about her job as a social worker and if that's going to have an impact in her ability to sit on this jury. So take a listen. Really emotional hearing from her up on the stand. And again, that video is something that we've all seen and been talking about for almost a year now. So it was kind of fascinating to hear her talk about that experience and talk about just the sequence of events that put her there that day. Also interesting, and BC, you talked about it with Lee quite a bit, this exchange between the defense attorney Eric Nelson and Donald Williams, one of the witnesses who was on the stand. You could see him there in the sweatshirt in that body cam video. Nelson was asking him, what were you saying to the officers? Kind of alluding to what he had said in his opening statements, trying to paint this picture that the officers there on scene were dealing with an angry crowd. So then when the state went back and questioned him, they asked about the emotions that day. So this is Prosecutor Frank asking about kind of those emotions, those feelings that bystanders were having. Take a listen. And it's also in that exchange you can see kind of the line that Judge Cahill is trying to draw, allowing Donald Williams to talk about what he saw, what he experienced, about his own personal experience with MMA. But Judge Cahill was really careful to draw the line not to allow him to make any kind of medical assessments. So that's what you see there, kind of that stop and go of Judge Cahill getting involved. So now we know the rest of the day we're going to hear from a few more minors. Just a note for people watching at home, you're not going to see those minors appear on camera, but you will hear their voice. So it will be interesting going forward here to see how each of these attorneys deal with having a young person on the stand. You saw Eric Nelson decided not to question the young girl who was up there just before this break. So that's more of what we can expect throughout the afternoon. In the store, what happened in the store, and then they went to Chris Belfry, and we have the video that they played when Chris was giving his testimony, which would be the moment that police went up to the vehicle that George Floyd was in, and shortly after they go up to that vehicle, they pull their guns. You can see that in the video that they shared when Chris Belfry was up on the stand. And now they're kind of going into this next part with Charles McMillan, this witness who's up on the stand right now. He's now talking about the moments earlier. It's become clear with some of these eyewitnesses that we were talking to yesterday and today that this is still really difficult for them to talk about. There's been a lot of emotional testimony, and especially with all this video evidence we have of them kind of reliving those moments, it's really challenging for them, really emotional. And, Judge Cahill called for this recess because there is kind of a line of how much emotion do you let in. Charles was kind of talking about, in the video that they played, you heard George Floyd calling for his mom, and you heard Charles start to say, my mom passed away in June. And Judge Cahill cut him off again because of just rules of the court of how much information they're allowed to share. They're really supposed to be sticking to the questions. So Judge Cahill giving him some time to collect himself before he comes back for questioning. But Again, it's evident. We also heard it from the store clerk. You know, he was talking about his regrets that day. He had said, if I hadn't accepted that bill, if I just would have said, no, no way, get out of here, none of this would have happened. So you're hearing a lot from people, the regret that they had that day of not helping more, which is interesting because we hear Eric Nelson say in his opening statements and kind of in his line of questioning that, you know, that there was this angry mob that were threatening police, but then you actually hear witnesses say, I wish that I would have gone further. I wish I would have done more. And it looks like we are getting back into court. Judge Cahill is up in his seat, so we'll take you more policies based on our de-escalation training. I thought that this was appropriate or not appropriate. So just kind of interesting as you're watching this to know that witnesses on the stand, they're not always able to say exactly what they're thinking or exactly what they would say in a normal conversation, but are kind of confined to some of these rules. So then, of course, it's cross-examination time. It's time for the defense to be able to come up and ask some questions to Chief Arredondo. And kind of a lot of the same when Eric Nelson was questioning the chief. He was kind of getting to the point of these policies look great on paper, but police officers have a complicated job and they're not always able to exactly execute policy exactly as it looks on paper. Of course, there's a lot of gray areas for police officers in that they end up in dangerous situations and can sometimes bend policy or policies change based on a level of threat. So after going through all of that, Eric Nelson then brought up a side-by-side video, and it was Officer King's body camera side-by-side with that bystander video. And what he did there is he was asking Chief Arredondo to watch about 10 seconds of that video just before George Floyd was put on a gurney and taken away by paramedics. So he showed about 10 seconds of this video and then asked Chief Arredondo about what he saw.
This is Kent Brockman with a special live report from the headquarters of crusty opponent John Armstrong. How can I prove we're live? Penis.
Yeah, well, I think we can expect to hear from more members of law enforcement. You know, we wrapped up the day yesterday with that police officer who used to be in charge of all of the training, you know, kind of establishing, sort of like the chief did, establishing what kind of training that the officers get, what are their expectations, what are the policies that they're expected to follow. We do know that those officers are limited somewhat in what they can say. Cumulative, it's called. The judge has kind of put a line of saying, you know, you can't have just a bunch of officers coming up here one after another saying exactly the same thing. There has to be a reason why they specifically are up there, what they can specifically talk about. So we know in pretrial motions yesterday, in addition to Blackwell, this officer who used to run the training program, we're expected to hear from another officer who runs their kind of critical incident response training. So we're expected to hear from him as well. These officers are also limited to not being able to just say, here, this is what I would have done in this situation. Basically, what they can say is, these are what our policies are, this is how we train our officers, and then are able to say if this, you know, this incident with Chauvin and Floyd, if it violated those policies. So we did get into a little bit yesterday with the chief after a long time establishing his record, his experience, establishing policies and expectations for his officers. We kind of took a turn where Steve Slisher, the attorney for the state, started asking, okay, so how did these actions on May 25th line up with those policies? So we have a bit of sound from the chief explaining that on the stand yesterday.